don't get hacked in 2020. Top breach threats and breach prevention controls. I just want to do a little intro since a lot of you may not be familiar with our company, Go Security Pro. We founded, my co-founder is my wife, Susan Wilson, and she has her law degree. And we are based out of Oklahoma. And, you know, we help businesses avoid data breaches and unwanted downtime. But something that makes us a little bit different than all the other consulting firms is we study data breach analytics, and that's a lot of what I'm going to be going into today, giving you insights onto what we're seeing in the past, really 3 months. We're looking at March through July data breach statistics, which I think is very timely and could bring a lot of value to people. But we also specialize in creating cybersecurity plans. So if you're in an organization where like, I don't know what to do next, I'm overwhelmed with, you know, all the projects we have going on, we could help out with that. So a little bit about me. You know, I've been in the information security field for 17 years, been a consultant for the last 8 years. I've had a lot of roles within IT departments as consultant. I taught a class at a university for 4 years, and a software developer. So, but really, you know, this is what it's all come down to is launching this company. And we're really excited about the value we're bringing to people, and excited about this talk today, and to be part of BSides is really an honor. So what I do is, you know, I don't try to put out a ton of content that makes your lives more difficult to consume. What I focus on is high value content that maybe doesn't come out as often as, you know, a regular blog or whatever. So here's some of the real high value stuff that we've done recently. And in the upper left, you'll see the 2020 Healthcare Data Breach Intelligence Report that came out in January. It was a big 30-page report on in the healthcare specific industry. And then we did a project with Zoom when everybody's going remote and wondered, what do I need to do with Zoom? Is it secure enough to use? And then in the lower left, we did a big IoT survival guide. How do you accommodate insecure IoT in your environment without putting your whole network at risk? Because it often does. And then in the lower right, one of the videos that I've done that's gotten a lot of traction is how I hacked an electric company. If you are in the energy electric sector, you should check that out. Essentially, you know, we're doing external, internal pen test, and normally we deploy like an appliance on the inside to get remote access into the network. This time I didn't need an appliance. I just use an external exploit to get inside the network to then escalate to then gain access to all their customer data. That's a cool case study. You should check it out. Okay, so in this talk, what are we doing today? How to use data breach analytics to enhance your cybersecurity program. So how can you look at the data and make, look at the freshest data and make really wise choices around what you're doing in your program based on data? And then we've been doing this for some time. What have we learned from our Q2 2020 data breach analytics? And really it's more than Q2, it's like March through today. And why that's important, I mean, we did this big study in January, but obviously COVID-19 happened, our entire work, you know, environment changed, and now we're facing a different set of threats. The threat actors have adjusted to this environment, this new environment. So we're gonna get some insights on what is happening breach-wise since we've made that transition to remote work. So just a little kind of overview of the numbers. I look at this every year and I'm thinking, man, it's just every year it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, this year it's looking down actually so far. 33% decrease in publicly reported data breaches. And this is from the Identity Theft Resource Center. So it certainly doesn't capture every breach that happens, and it captures breaches that involve consumer data, not necessarily, you know, proprietary business information that you don't have to do notifications to individuals. So these are like where notifications are sent out to individuals. And Right. So it's down. And so this graph shows a projection of if the trend stays, we'll be at 1,080 breaches that they track at the end of the year. I think it's still going to ramp up beyond that, but the Identity Theft Resource Center has some theories as to why that trend is happening. And they're, saying that attackers are less focused on gathering new data and more focused on using the data they have. And ultimately the data they have will become out of date and they'll have to get new data. So it'll just go up. But it's kind of interesting. I never really see it go down like that. And maybe the attackers are thrown off by having to work from home. I don't know. So, and then if you look at number of individuals impacted, there's been a 66% decrease in the number of individuals impacted compared to the first 6 months of 2019. So, and again, those numbers can be skewed greatly by a big breach, like a mega breach, right? You can see 2017 had some mega breaches, but again, don't expect this trend to be long-term. I don't really know what to make of this data, just stuff is down, right? But if you look at healthcare, and I love healthcare because the transparency is much greater. You can see that the number of OCR reported breaches is actually about the same if we project, what's happened so far. And we're on track. There's no 33% decrease like we saw in the previous graph. Then the graph on the right I don't know a whole lot to make of that. It's more consistent with the ITRC data, but so, this will vary from industry to industry, these trends. So how do we prevent breaches in Q3, Q4, 2020? So step number 1, identify your critical breach causing weaknesses. Step number 2, follow a prioritized plan to mitigate these weaknesses. I mean, yeah, you knew that already. But the key here is that if you do some data breach analytics, it enhances both of those. It makes both of those more effective. For example, say you're an InfoSec analyst in the InfoSec industry in healthcare. And if you don't realize that one of the top breach causing threats in healthcare is physical mailing errors, you may not be doing anything to prevent that or having controls put in place. But in fact, that is one of the big breach causes in healthcare, where you mail out a letter to an individual and it's actually addressed to the wrong person. So somebody's seeing somebody else's information, or the envelope in the window is too big and it divulges information it shouldn't through the window. This is a big cause of breaches in healthcare. So, identifying those causes, a lot of them are going to be no-brainer, like, oh yeah, phishing, that's a big cause, right? We all know that. But like some other causes aren't as front and center. Right. And then step number 2, if we can prioritize, that'll help us with our planning. So you might be thinking, Geoff, I can just go to How I've Been Pwned and Troy Hunt puts all this information together and they're tracking data breaches. Isn't this exactly what you're talking about? Well, no, this is a consumer facing tool. It's really good. It's awesome for what it's designed for. It doesn't answer the question we have though. What How I've Been Pwned answers is, has my email address been associated with a published data breach set? Or if, which online passwords do I need to change? Organizations can sign up to be alerted if anyone in the organization's account appears on that list. So that's another cool use of it. But the questions we're answering in this question, what InfoSec professionals are needing to answer is, how can I prevent the next breach? Why are these breaches happening? And what is the most likely breach scenario? Have I Been Pwned doesn't answer that. So where do we get this data, right? So there are lots of sources. And there's industry data breach reports. One of the ones I like the most is the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. And they look at 3,950 breaches for the 2020 report. That's a lot of data breaches, even way more than the Identity Theft Resource Center has their hands on. And that's because they deal with industries that don't have the obligation to report. So it breaks it down per industry, per geographic region. It captures industries that don't handle consumer data. So a lot of strengths in this type of report. Shortcomings is it can become quickly out of date. So take 2019, this is the 2020 DBIR is looking at 2019 data. Is that the same threat landscape as we're facing now in Q3 2020? The world has changed significantly, and we can't just go verbatim off of this report and align our plan to it. So, and what if your industry is not represented? And there's a lot of information, tons of information, which I love, but it's not easy to digest and distill into a plan. And yes, it does touch on the critical security controls. And here's a graphic that shows on the vertical axis, the critical security control number 1 through 20. And then on the horizontal axis, it's threat scenarios. So if you look at any given one, okay, I wanted to defend against, let's see, cyber espionage. Well, in a nutshell, you got to do everything. That doesn't help me prioritize. Okay, well, what about, I want to do crimeware. Okay, well, you got to do half of the CIS critical security controls. Okay, great. Which one do I do first? Still not entirely useful enough for tactical use. So, industry information sharing communities like your ISACs, MS ISAC, retail and hospitality ISAC, all these ISACs are awesome. You know, join them, network with your peers, understand how other companies similar to yours are getting hacked. But it's often too much information, hundreds of threads per day in some of these ISACs. Where does today's threat notice go in our priority stack? Again, it doesn't help us prioritize a whole lot. And then expert bulletins like US CERT. I highly recommend signing up for their bulletins. They're awesome, actionable intelligence. They're usually very high quality, in-depth recommendations, but it's challenging to take that and integrate it into your program sometimes because alerts may not even apply to you. You'd be like, why am I getting too much information and too many recommendations? Like in the last bulletin, they had 13 recommendations. Okay, great. So which one do I do first? There's a lot of work to be done in these recommendations. And then how do I take today's threat notice and incorporate it into my plan? And just general information overload in some senses, I don't know, 17 alerts in 2020, 13 recommendations, in an alert, that's a lot of recommendations. So another source you can get this information from is consultants like me. Independent, fresh set of eyes. We've seen in a variety of approaches to cybersecurity. Shortcoming is it's not often easy to judge the experience and quality of a consultant. Did they stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night? Or are they actually like good at what they do? Check bios, check references, look at all that. Ask for referrals. So consultants are getting their information the same way you are. I mean, we're hearing people talk about the 2017 DBIR, the Verizon DBIR. Does that really apply now? That's a long time ago. And so, I mean, are they up on everything? And honestly, it's really hard to keep up on the threat landscape. It's still not timely enough in a lot of situations. And obviously it's not free, except a free consultation. And I will definitely offer that up. So there is another way to get the data, which is how we've been doing it, but it's not for everyone. It's not for the faint at heart because it requires a lot of work. US states, all 50 states have data breach laws at this point. 11 of them require the victim organization to provide a breach notice sample to the state, and then they publish those. So this to me indicates a major transparency problem. This is a state-by-state patchwork of approaches. We need to be seeing data breach notices that go out. It's really hard to find them in some cases. More states should be doing this, and really a broader, holistic US approach would be preferred. But anyway, let's look at like Massachusetts. What do they publish? So if you go to Massachusetts website, you'll see a big, table of hundreds of, actually thousands of breaches. And so here's a page of that. And you'll see that each of these, you got organization name, you've got number of this MA residents affected column. Most states just publish how many residents in their state were affected, not how many US residents, not how many global individuals were affected. And so again, you're not seeing a complete picture here. Whether SSNs were breached, you got a lot of what data was breached. And then was it encrypted? And was it a mobile device lost or stolen? Every state has their own approach to what fields they capture and how they report it. So let's look at this one breach, Morgan Stanley, that's through almost 400,000 individuals, Massachusetts residents. And you might come across something like this. You can dig in and pull up the actual data breach notice. This is a scan of a printed document. You can't, search this OCR. I mean, maybe you can OCR it and then search it, but you can read it, and it's sometimes helpful. Morgan Stanley closed 2 data centers and decommissioned the computer equipment in both locations. As is customary, we contracted with a vendor to remove the data from the devices. We subsequently learned that certain devices believed to have been wiped for all information still contain some unencrypted data. Separately, we blah, 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 and we lost a server. So, this is super useful, super actionable information. Okay, we need to be looking at our third parties and about how if we trust them to do secure data disposal, we have to validate that and do good vendor management. So, this type of information is super useful and super timely. And this is from July 2020. This is what's happening right now. Well, happened in 2019, but this is what we're learning of these data breaches right now. So state of Wisconsin has a different approach. Of course, every state has its own approach. And they actually digitize this, which is nice. You don't have to look at, scanned printouts and stuff. You can actually see the breakouts of this information. Okay, so state of Wisconsin has a different approach. So the strengths here is we get a lot more detail on these breaches in many cases. It's timely information. The shortcoming is it's not easy to parse. It may only list the residents in that state. And there's no, you might have a breach in Massachusetts that's also represented in the California data set, and there's no mapping between those two. And so it's a challenge, and there's a good reason why people don't look at this stuff, because it's a lot of information, and you got to take a lot of time to do this. Here's my preferred method of looking at this is HIPAA data breach disclosures. When a HIPAA covered entity suffers a breach, or a business associate of theirs suffers a breach, they are obligated to report that if it affects more than 500 people immediately to the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. They're the enforcement arm of HIPAA. And what the law requires OCR to do then is to post that to their website. So you can go to this website, OCR portal, to view every healthcare data breach that's been reported to OCR. Plus, what I really like about the HIPAA regs is that if a breach involves more than 500 persons in a state, the covered entity has to notify a local media outlet or have a substitute notice go out within 60 days of discovery. And so that notice is going to go into what happened, what are they doing to fix it. And so we get a lot of breach notices in the healthcare space that are accessible. So if you look at, and what this is exactly what I study here, because it's a lot easier to parse than the state data, and it gives a more holistic US, wide approach. And so the OCR data captures all 3,300 healthcare data breaches dating back to 2009. What I like about it is not state specific. And then OCR investigates each one of those. And then once they're done with their investigation, they will put in more context around what happened and what's the corrective action plan that provider has agreed to or is taking on. The downside is that corrective action plan and OCR's comments come out like 3 to 6 months after the breach finds its way onto the breach portal. Another shortcoming, still a lot of data to sift through. And if a business associate is breached and it affects multiple covered entities, then it'll be listed on there per covered entity. So you might have one breach that's listed like 10 times if 10 covered entities were affected by one business associate. So you got to take that into account too. So here's what that website looks like. And you can see there's a section for under investigation, which is OCR hasn't finished their comments yet, hasn't published that. And archive is old ones that our OCR has finished the investigation on, and their comments are out there. So let's look at this one that happened July 17th, 2020, just a couple days ago. So, what I do is I just take that, healthcare provider, and I Google it and I put breach after it, and you find their notice oftentimes. Sometimes you can't find it. And a lot of times it actually takes you back to the state repository where the states are keeping these notices. I find a lot of them through Massachusetts and California. So like on this one, this isn't very helpful. They experienced a data security incident that encrypted some of its information. So I interpret that as ransomware. And it doesn't say a whole lot about how it got in, what are they doing to remediate. So this one's not super helpful, but it's part of what they have to put out. Sometimes you'll find a lot of information, and this is way too much information to put in a breach notice. Here's a company that had a breach, and they say, okay, we've onboarded Mandiant's MDR service. We have deployed additional FireEye network sensors. We have, we're doing twice weekly vulnerability scans. And if you zoom down to, middle of the bottom section there, verified that Trend Micro is installed and running properly. So now we know that this company uses Trend Micro as their antivirus product. That's useful to an attacker. Now I can, change my payload to avoid Trend Micro. Obviously you got to avoid the MDR service as well, but you got somewhere to start. So usually don't see this kind of detail. But in this case, they decided to post it. So, okay, great. We know how to get to the data. It's a lot of work. Geoff, you said you've looked at this data. So what have you found? Okay, so that's where we're at. Initially, for our big January report, we analyzed the 117 most recent healthcare data breaches. But then what happened? COVID-19. So the threat landscape changed. And I was like, I can't go to BSides and talk about 2019 data. That's not going to be cool. Let's do some new research and see what the trends are right now from March to July and talk about that. So what I did was I analyzed 137 healthcare data breaches reported in that time frame. I manually researched each breach, read through the breach notices, sorted, cataloged, all of that, including notice samples, press releases, and articles published by other people. So the number one breach threat, and yeah, let's go. Email account compromise. This astounded me. Almost half of all breaches right now are email account compromise. And they're usually attacks through phishing, where you gain access to a password. And then, we look in that account and, there's a bunch of regulated data, a bunch of PHI, and now we got to, declare a breach. So that's a huge, staggering number. Let's look at one example. This is Legacy Community Health Services. And, we learned that a legacy employee responded to a phishing email, believed it to be legitimate. And then we scanned down to the bottom. To prevent something from happening like this from happening again, we're enhancing our email security. We have enabled multi-factor authentication on all email accounts, and we are reinforcing education with our employees on how to identify and avoid phishing emails. Perfect. This is great. Good information. And we've got those corrective actions that really give insights to other organizations and security professionals how you go about defending this stuff. So what does that look like? Multi-factor authentication. Our perimeters are changing with the pandemic, right? We've got to look at our perimeters no longer as being just the firewall to our network. Yes, you need multi-factor to VPN into your network. That's for sure. Or to remote desktop in, or however you get into your network remotely. But then also, if you're logging into internet-facing services, say you have an OWA server that's publicly accessible, you need multi-factor authentication on that. Cloud apps, Office 365, Box, put multi-factor authentication on those, because those are remote access points into your network as well. And then, a more mature program will put MFA on escalation to privileged access within your environment. And, I really agreed with Jordan's keynote this morning. Passwords suck. They're terrible. I always get access to passwords on every pen test, it seems like. And we need more security than just passwords. Granted, I don't think we're going to get rid of them anytime soon, but if you just have passwords and you don't have something like multi-factor, it's like you're defending a castle with just the perimeter walls. It's going to work for a short time until somebody brings a ladder, and then you're screwed, right? So multi-factor authentication stops breaches. It's staggering. I'm working with a Fortune 500 company that doesn't have multi-factor authentication on their remote VPN. I was shocked. And they're a mature security program. So many breaches that I'm working right now from an incident response perspective come back to multi-factor, but don't just take my word for it. Let's look at Microsoft. They presented at RSA in February, and they track 30 billion login events every day to their consumer services. That's a lot of login events. And in any given month, 0.5% of all accounts are compromised. Holy crap. That means 1.2 million accounts are compromised in January alone. And 99.99% of those don't have multi-factor authentication turned on. So basically, MFA is a big contributor or a big defender here. 11% of users on their services are using multi-factor in some form. That's not much. We've got a lot of work to do, people. That's 1 out of 10 users have multi-factor enabled. And, list goes on and on here. What's interesting, what their talk was about legacy authentication protocols like IMAP, SMTP, POP3. These don't support multi-factor authentication. So you need to disable them if you can, because, they'll do, attackers will do password spray attempts. They'll get a user list and they'll do password spray attempts trying the password like spring 2020 ! On every user in your entire directory. And they'll get, 1 or 2. That's how, I do a lot of password sprayings on pen tests. And this, when I have a complete user list, this always works. Google two-step verification. Here's, and Jordan had this slide up in his keynote. Great points he was making there. So the key takeaway here is multi-factor authentication is going to 100% prevent against automated attacks that they're seeing in their study. Well, as a security professional, I can't say something's ever 100%, but in their study, it did protect 100% during that range. And then you look at, okay, so then there are other, targeted attacks. Sure, SMS codes aren't as great against targeted attacks, but they're really good, a lot better than nothing. So you're seeing, okay, security keys probably the best, on-device prompt is probably next, and then SMS code is third. Well, really, you have another option. You got 4 options here. Physical token on the right, that's going to be your most secure option. Then, something like Duo in the upper left, and I'm not plugging Duo. I love this screenshot here that shows you log in and it pops up on your device. Is that you? You just hit yes, and then you're in. Soft token MFA. This is a screenshot of Authy. I use Authy personally, and I track. I've got probably 15 accounts in there now that use multi-factor authentication. And then a lot of services only support SMS based, so text messages, and that's fine. If that's all they support, turn it on. Try to go with one of the other secure ones. I like Authy, but physical token obviously is better. So preventing email compromise. As a defender, what do we need to do? So let's require multi-factor authentication for all accounts, for remote access into cloud hosted things, into your perimeter. Disable legacy email protocols. Microsoft says that by doing that, you reduce compromise 67% just by removing legacy protocols that don't support multi-factor. And then disable email forwarding. Attackers love to use email forwarding so they don't have to stay logged into your email account. They'll siphon out your email to an attacker-controlled email account, watching it. waiting for the right opportunity for an invoice to go across, and they log back in and say, oops, I made a mistake on the invoice. Here's the new one with the money going overseas. And then training users on how to spot a phishing email. This is not done enough. We're going to talk about that here in a second. Number 2 breach threat. You ready for it? Phishing. Big surprise, right? We always know phishing is a huge threat. It's in 24% of the breaches that I looked at in the Q2 2020 range. And that's consistent with what we saw in 2019. It's not a huge uptick. It's about the same. So, but they're getting, and I'm not saying that email compromise and phishing are mutually exclusive. Sometimes they're both. And we're just looking at what's the trend here, right? Here's an example of phishing trying to get email compromise. Here's an actual email I received in April. And how do you verify this email is legitimate? I use this case in my security awareness that I give to organizations. First off, if you look at the from address, it's not in my organization. So these are like red flags you need to be teaching your people how to identify. High importance. There's urgency associated with this. There's an attachment that's a .htm. I don't really usually get .htm files. That's weird. And then at the bottom, it's talking about accounts payable associate. I don't have that in my company. You know, obviously, I'm not going to fall for this, but you can see how an organization would fall for it, maybe a larger one. And it's got my logo and everything. And it's, so, all right, let's click on it, see what happens, right? We're security researchers. So what happens if I click on it? This HTML file has some obfuscated JavaScript, right? You can decode that, and you'll see that it takes you to true payable secure.top / a bunch of gibberish. So, all right, let's go to that website, see what happens. So obviously I'm in my Kali sandbox. I'm not touching this on my Windows system. And so, you know, it's not gonna have any authentication tokens in the browser or anything like that. So what's interesting, this really looks like the Microsoft Office 365 login. And if you click those things on the bottom, the copyright, terms of use, privacy, and cookies, nothing happens. They're like dead links. So the only thing you can do on this page is click, I'm not a robot, continue. And then it says, pick an account. Holy crap, it's got my email address. How did, hey, yeah, thanks, Ogs. How did this, please don't phish me. How did this know my email address, right? Well, it turns out that gibberish at the end of the URL was actually an encoding of my email address. So what I decided to do was take a different email address, encode it, and then provide it back to the server. So now it thinks I'm me at me.com. Enter your password. And, you know, so I typed in a password. Obviously, you know, I'm not giving my real password or anything. The forgot my password link is dead. If you click sign in, it'll, I forget, there were 2 of them. One of them takes you to the real Office 365 sign in page. The other one says, oh, that didn't work, try again. So anyway, show examples like that to your folks to get them thinking about how to look at these emails. Security awareness training. You got to do this. If you're not doing security awareness training, you're missing the huge opportunity to enhance security at your organization. If you're doing phishing tests and not training your people, then you're just testing if they're smart or dumb. And that's not cool. So here's a slide that probably the best slide in my whole security awareness presentation that I give to organizations. How to spot a phishing URL. So look for the first /, not including the 2 after the HTTP. Look immediately to the left of that for the top level domain, and then look immediately to the left of the preceding dot to identify the domain. Then we work through a series of exercises. Okay, this domain down here, what is it? It looks like office.microsoft.com, right? No, it's actually goodsite.ru, Russia. So I go through probably 20 of these different varieties of URL types and just help them identify that. So now they have the knowledge to look at that, to look at a URL and understand what it means. Malicious attachments. What does it mean to see a malicious Office document with macros in it? And you know, this is exactly what that is. This is a malicious Office document, and showing them what that looks like. I think that's cool. Breach threat number 3. Ready? Ransomware. This actually went up significantly from 2019. It's up 222%. And I don't think it's more common. Maybe it's a little more common, but I don't know if you remember at the beginning of the COVID crisis, ransomware operators said, "Hey, we're not gonna ransom healthcare right now because you know we care about them or something." I'm not seeing that in the numbers. It's way up, but I think the issue here is that it's moving from an incident to a breach because of double extortion. Let's talk about that. So what's an incident versus a breach? So quit calling things breaches until it's met a legal threshold and your legal team has reviewed that to say, okay, it meets the legal threshold and we have an obligation to notify people. That's when it becomes a breach. So everything's an event or an incident until then. And ransomware in the past has often been considered an incident because if somebody encrypts my data, it's not really losing confidentiality, right? Well, that's arguable. But that's what people are taking. And so a lot of times people don't report that in the healthcare space, but they should. Actually, there's a rule that requires you to if ransomware has encrypted PHI. That's a definite breach. But I don't think people were too aware of that guidance that was put out by OCR. So what's double extortion ransomware? So that's where the attacker gains unauthorized access to data, and first they exfiltrate it before they encrypt it. They take it out of your environment, and then they encrypt it and lock it up. So now they're going to give you two ransoms, one to decrypt your files. If you pay that one, another ransom to not post it online on the dark web or whatever. This was not at all prominent in 2019. I couldn't find an example in the healthcare space of this. I'm sure it was going on, but it wasn't as common. Double extortion, I'm finding it in 25% of the ransomware breaches in Q2. Here's an example. The AKO ransomware operators put the hurt on North Shore Pain Management in Massachusetts, pun intended. Here's their data breach notice. An unauthorized person gained access to some of our files. Okay, that's like the least helpful notice I've ever seen. Anyway, so, but here is a blog post by databreaches.net who did a great write-up about how they were double extorted. The attackers, the ATO group, dumped 4 gigs of patient data and employee data and put up screenshots as proof. You know, obviously they've been redacted here. They put some very large PDFs out there with EPHI, and the decrypt ransom is often, I don't know that exact ransom of this case, but it's often like $350,000. And then if they double extort you, it's going to be another 50% higher than that usually. So you might have a $700,000 ransom just to not have it posted online. So anyway, it's scary stuff. So preventing ransomware is a little more complex. There's a lot of controls that can contribute to ransomware prevention. It kind of boils down to a lot of malicious code prevention in general. But the key ones here are network file share least privilege. If Joe's computer gets infected with ransomware, the ransomware is going to look for mapped drives. It's going to look for network file shares and try to encrypt everything it has access to. If you restrict what Joe has access to only what he needs, that's going to greatly limit the impact of the ransomware. Dropping down to the 4th bullet, if you have a cloud service like, let's say, Google Drive or Office 365, OneDrive, and your employees have those sync applications that constantly sync data to a mapped drive on their computer, the ransomware is going to hit those documents too. So you need to make sure you enable file versioning for your cloud applications where data is synced locally. And then the middle 2 bullets, backups. Make sure your backups are good. Make sure they're air gapped so the attacker can't encrypt the backups as well. Not necessarily air gap, but definitely limit access to them. Air gap's probably the best approach. And then other good ideas that just contribute to prevention here: monitoring, phishing training, incident response planning that accounts for ransomware. Okay, number 4, breach threat, and we're looking good so far. Insider threat and error-related breaches. I chalked this up as a tie. They were 11% and 10%. Errors include things like, oh, I accidentally attached a spreadsheet I shouldn't have. I CC'd everybody instead of BCCing everybody. Physical mailing that I talked about before. and misconfiguration. Oh, I've got a leaky Amazon S3 bucket out there. So, and then insider threat are things like looking, like there's a healthcare entity whose worker was looking for who in the organization has tested positive for COVID-19. We can't do that. That's a privacy violation. That's a breach. And then, you know, we got employees forwarding stuff to their personal account, to their personal computer. And then there was a case of an employee taking all their patient data to a new employer so that they could advertise that they've now switched providers and, hey, everybody come over here for your business now. That's a definite no-no. So that's the type of insider threat we're seeing. And with error-related breaches, what's interesting, the Verizon DBIR is they're seeing errors as the only category that's increasing over time. Everything else kind of goes down or goes down and up, but errors just are increasing over time from 2015 to 2020, becoming more prominent. And so this is not just a healthcare thing. This is a cybersecurity wide thing. So are we becoming less careful, more error prone? I don't have the right answer for that. I think that, you know, a lot of our business processes are becoming more complex. We're doing a lot more remote work. Just something to be aware of and to train and prevent that. So to prevent error-related breaches, train key employees on how to avoid breach mistakes. So, you know, if somebody's dealing with physical mailing, train them or help them create a quality assurance process where they're spot checking as they go. Making sure you readjust your business processes so that sensitive information isn't distributed via email. And then insider threat. Make sure you address that in security awareness training. Review key user access patterns as an indicator. So, an additional shortcoming. I've talked about this healthcare data, but what it doesn't cover is, and really this is most breach notices, they'll tell you how the attacker got in. They'll tell you the initial attack vector. They won't tell you how the attacker laterally moved and escalated privileges to, you know, really exploit them. And so this is a bonus from our consulting and incident response work in 2020. We're seeing some serious trends here. So, and I'm hearing some of these sentiments echoed on other talks. Don't log into workstations with domain administrator accounts. Instead, use the local administrator account. I was on a pen test a few weeks ago, and you know, there was one system that didn't have the blue keep patch. Boom, I get system access over that computer. And then turns out the domain admin had logged into that system, run Mimikatz, and there's the domain admin password. Instantly, I'm domain admin. So not logging into workstations with domain administrator is huge. You should really only log into the domain server with domain administrator accounts, right? And maybe a small set of servers, but try not to do that if you can't, if you can avoid it. Deploy laps. I know Aaron Moss talked about that in his talk, right? Microsoft's local administrator password solution. That's key so that not all computers have the same local administrator password. So if I'm able to crack one of those local admin passwords, I can't then log into every other computer. Configure service accounts and user accounts for least privilege. If I've got a privileged token on like a domain token on a system, let's say there's a service running with domain admin privileges, I can easily get, if I can get control of that system, I can easily escalate to domain admin. Patching systems. Yes, it's 2020, but it's still a challenge. I'm coming across a lot of systems not patched. And then change default passwords and test for default passwords. If you're getting a pen test, make sure that they do a thorough test for all default passwords on all user interfaces. In our tests, I usually come across 5 to 10 default passwords in each test. Some of those are for big things like system management software, like physical badge management server, really significant things that may not have been discovered otherwise. So, but the real value in looking at data breach analytics is not just knowing the threats, but knowing how to prioritize and plan around this, because we've got so much on our plates. How do I prioritize 20 critical security controls? Well, you can start by learning what's the most common. Let's start with email account compromise. If you don't know anywhere else to start, right now, that is the biggest threat that I'm seeing. Start locking that down, and phishing goes hand in hand with that. they're often in combination with each other. So you can, you can do your own research and come to your own conclusions. But I think oftentimes as consultants and in our industry, oftentimes we're missing the mark. I think there's an overemphasis on assessments. And organizations struggle to take an assessment and actually turn it into a plan. Because I'm seeing a lot of folks that, okay, they get a report, but they don't know what to do with it. It's too much information, doesn't prioritize adequately for them. Hey, great, I've got 50 things to fix. Which one do I start with? So what if instead of delivering an assessment, we delivered a strategic security implementation plan? And that's what we do. We focus on cybersecurity planning, not on assessments. But, if you're interested, I would love to talk to you. We're getting close to end of time here. But our key kind of service that we offer is we meet you where you're at, where if you just had an assessment, great time to put together a plan. If you hadn't had an assessment, great, let's start and let's get a plan put in place for you. And so this helps you really track your progress and know kind of in a phased approach how to address cybersecurity. And we use our data breach analytics to inform that. So I think I'm good. I would love to talk to anyone who has questions or, wants a free consultation. I would please ask you to like and follow us. I put out some high value content every once in a while. You can see my socials there, social network information there. Please like and follow. Drop me a line and I'll be checking in on Slack. So if you have a question, and James, I don't know if there's a question that's come through, but would love to answer any questions you have.
I haven't seen any thus far, so I think we're good on the questions.
Awesome.
Again, if there are any questions, let us know. And Geoff should be around all day in the Slack channels. And so we should have him there lurking about. But thank you so much for giving this talk, Geoff. It was very insightful, honestly.
Yeah.
And thank you. Thank you for the information as always.
You bet. My pleasure. Take care, all.